The historical development of the Indian Act. Indigenous people lived in the land that we now know as Canada for thousands of years. In the 15th century, French and British people traveled to North America and set up home bases in Canada. There were some skirmishes when Europeans first came to Canada. However, during the early years, the Indigenous people, to a degree, shared in decision-making for trade practices and lived alongside the Europeans. In particular, the Aboriginals and French people got along fairly well, traded, and at times intermarried. But that all changed. Britain and France had disputes over who Canadian land belonged to. But Britain won, and they had to decide what to do with Indigenous people that they called Indians. King George made a royal proclamation in 1763. The proclamation declared that Indian people on Indian land were to be protected from dishonest land spectators and traders. Some people even called this proclamation the Indian Magna Carta. After the War of 1812, traditional roles for Aboriginal people disappeared rapidly. The British policymakers had to decide what role and place the First Nations people should have. The policy included the following: temporarily placing them on reserved lands, dress them in European clothes, teach them to become self-sustaining British citizens by becoming productive farmers. Have policymakers enforce the above. Policymakers thought assimilation would be quick. The Indigenous people of Canada were not invited to the table to discuss, develop, or enact these new policies. Over the next several years, there were numerous government investigations of Indian policy and the new administrative arrangements. There was some recognition that Indian policy and administrative practices were too paternalistic, but no other arrangements were introduced or thought to be viable, so officials were happy to go along and keep the status quo. Policymakers over time became impatient with the slow progress of assimilation, so a new act was created, called an Act to encourage the gradual civilization of the Indian tribes in this province, and to amend the laws respecting Indians. This legislation set down a policy and procedure where all legal distinctions between natives and non-natives would be removed, by creating total assimilation of the First Nations people. Over time, the British left the matter of First Nations people and their status in the hands of Canada to handle.